Boston, Friends of Camp Constitution's monthly luncheon, and the John Birch Society's Greater Boston Business Luncheon, who collaborated. That's why we get such a big full house, I believe, on a hot late July day. It is my distinct pleasure to have Lord Monckton here. And Lord Monckton, I first met him very briefly at a climate change conference that was hosted by the Heartland Institute in 2009, 2 years in a row, 9 and I think 10. I was there on behalf of the New American, helping Bill Jasper and Ed Hizarat doing work. And he was one of the keynote speakers, Lord Monckton. And he was told not to be insulting to the people who support climate change. And he got up and he referred to them as bedwetters. And I said, this guy, we got to get this guy up here. And then he was Ed Hizarat had interviewed him. Now, Ed Hizarat's the science writer for the New American. And he said, just what exactly is a Viscount? He pronounced it correctly, not viscount, as we would say here probably. He said, I think, I'm not quoting it verbatim, but something like, well, I don't know about Viscounts, but this one comes to the United States, the colonies, to cause trouble every so often. So he's here to cause as much trouble as he can, and I think you might know his background. That's right, the good kind. He's a lord. He was an advisor to Margaret Thatcher when he was a little bit younger. He's an accomplished journalist. He's written extensively. He's probably one of the world's top experts on the subject of climate change. He's involved with the Brexit movement. That's his topic today. He might talk a little bit about the recent election in Great Britain. And I have an interesting story. We all know Willie Soon, Professor Willie Soon. And I think Willie's the main reason why he's here, thanks to our friendship with Willie. Well, Willie was invited to speak in Moscow, Russia, on climate change issues. He wasn't invited by private citizens, but by the city of Moscow, some city officials. And this was 2 years ago. Well, Willie really didn't want to go. Instead, his son said, no, Mr. Shurtleff is taking us shooting up at Dr. Long's home in the White Mountains. So we don't want you to go to Moscow. So Willie put a call into Lord Monckton, and Lord Monckton went in his behalf. I said, Willie, you must be a very important guy. You get a British lord as your backup quarterback. So without further ado, let's... Lord.
My lords, distinguished professor, ladies, gentlemen, and rebellious colonials. What a delight it is to be here. Because, you see, I know that you have had your issues in the past with monarchy and with aristocracy. So I have just 2 words for you today. We're back. And on behalf of Her Majesty the Queen, I am empowered to offer you the following deal. If you will agree that you will cast off your rebellion, get rid of your government, and accept that you should be governed from as far away as possible by the competent governments of the United Kingdom that you will have seen over the last few years, then I shall, in return, offer you this remission of all taxes, charges and imposts that you now pay to the federal government and to the states, and they will be replaced with a single tax of £0.5 a pound on tea. And the only stipulation is that in future you will pour the tea not into the harbour but into the teapot. It tastes better that way. Well, my topic for today is an ancient one. The early philosophers of the Chinese Empire, when they were studying what is the big divide in politics, meditated upon this, and they said the big divide in politics is between 2 factions whom they called the legalists and the Confucians. And we would call them today the totalitarians and the libertarians. The totalitarians who want to control every tiny aspect of every citizen's life because they think they know best what's good for us. And totalitarianism is the very antithesis of democracy. And the libertarians, on the other hand, who think, as Confucius himself did, if you read his Analects, you will see what a very liberal-minded, in the proper sense, gentleman, not in the political sense that you have here. He was a man who thought that government should be small, distant, infrequent, untroubling, and that the people should be maximally free to run their own affairs and do their own thing. So the legalists versus the Confucians, the totalitarians versus the libertarians. This is the age-old conflict in politics. Sometimes, of course, you get conflicts between totalitarians and totalitarians, and that's where wars usually come from. And sometimes you get conflicts between totalitarians and democracies, and that was what the Second World War was about. But notice that you never get wars between democracy and democracy. And why? Because the people wear the bricks, and they won't stand for it. So democracy is a good thing, and your founding fathers realized this when they decided that they no longer wished to be governed by us. This was a mistake, as you have all long since realized, but that was their decision. And they then did a remarkable thing. And it was a summer rather like you've had in the last few days here. It was very hot, probably a lot hotter than this summer. It was sticky in Philadelphia, and they sat down through that long hot summer and they hammered out the Constitution of the United States. And they not only hammered it out behind closed doors, but they had journalists among them who were part of this process and who then reported what was going on, and those reports were very widely circulated, and of course the Library of Congress has them all available to us today. You will have seen, for instance, the Madison Papers, which by no means the only such reports that were kept and circulated at the time. So that this process of creating a constitution was not a top-down process whereby the great and the good said, well, we know what's best for the people. Instead, they said the people need to be part of this conversation so that we can make sure that the people get their way. And as a result, your constitution is not a constitution that says what the government can do and what the people mustn't do. It says what the people can do and what the states can do and what the government mustn't do. Right. And in this respect, it is unique in the history of politics. It is an extremely valuable document. It's a document which I, for one, enormously admire. Now, why do I talk about the US Constitution in a talk which was billed to be one about the European Union? Well, the reason is this, that the European Union has taken several steps backwards. And instead of setting up a constitution which involved the people in its creation, it was a top-down process which began shortly after the Second World War as an amiable project to ensure that in the rebuilding of Europe after the war, each country would have sufficient supplies of coal and of steel to rebuild Europe. And so the European Coal and Steel Community was founded. Then one or two ambitious politicians, Jean Monnet among them, said, why don't we set up a government of Europe and make it a European community of nations with a common governing structure? But notice they were more concerned with the governing structure than with the people. And it started out as a perfectly technocratic thing where civil servants were shuffling coal and steel around Europe, and then it grew into what has now become effectively a United States without the unity, without the states, and certainly without the democracy. And this is a huge problem for Britain because the mother of parliaments is a democratic institution, and the progress towards democracy in the United Kingdom from Magna Carta down to the present day has been slow and painful and inch by inch and hard won. And then suddenly we joined the European communities in 1972 without quite understanding what we were doing, and we discovered that we were now part of a tyranny by Clark, which gave the people no say in how it developed. Oh, they can elect members of the European Parliament, so-called, but the European Parliament, so-called, is a strange beast. Supposing I said to you that in future Congress would no longer be able to bring forward a bill, but only unelected bureaucrats could decide what bills went before your elected representatives for decision. Would you like that?
No.
Would anybody here like that? I don't think so. But it gets worse, because in the European tyranny by clerk, once the bureaucrats, they're called commissars, that's the official German name for them. The commissioners are called commissars. There's one from each country, nobody elects them, I don't even know who they are at the moment. They're shadowy figures, they have diplomatic immunity, a lot of them have their own private jets at the expense of the European taxpayer. But these commissars, once they have proposed a law, then the European Parliament must consider that law, and suppose they decide to vote it down, the first thing that happens is that an unelected Council of Ministers, an unelected Commission, and then a few representatives of the elected Parliament of Europe sit down to try and hammer out a compromise. And effectively that means the European Parliament ends up doing what the commissars tell them. But if they stand firm, as on rare occasions they do, then the commissars have the right at any time, without further notice to anyone, and without putting it in front of any elected parliament, whether the European Parliament or any national parliament, they have the right to issue that law as what is called a commission regulation. And that law, which has never been considered by any elected representative, becomes the immediate supreme law of the whole of the European Union and all of its member states, and it has to be obeyed. Now, whatever else that is, ladies and gentlemen, it is not democracy. Now, most people in the United Kingdom do not know what I have just told you, because the news media have never told them. I found this out by reading the treaties, which are deliberately long, multifarious, and inspisate and obscurantist. In other words, you can't understand what the heck they're saying. And it takes a long time to work out what they're saying. But what they're essentially saying is, we are the masters now, you will do as you are told. And the establishment in Britain, the civil service, and about 4/5 of the elected parliament actually think it's a good idea that the ruling class of Europe should tell the people of Britain how to live their lives, down to the last flickering poison-filled light bulb that we are now required to use in our homes rather than proper light bulbs. That is how intrusive and pernickety this tyranny by clerk has become. And that is why we wanted to leave, or half of us did, because one of the things you will notice down history from the time of the early Chinese to the present day is that always there is a balance of more or less 50-50 between the totalitarians and the libertarians. And so we were very lucky that the libertarians 3 years ago prevailed by 52% of the vote to 48, and we voted to leave the European Union. And so the people expressed their will, and you might therefore
That's worth an applause.
you might therefore expect that we left the European Union because the people had spoken, and the majority was 1 3/4 million, which in a tiny country like Britain actually is quite a large majority, and therefore it was a decisive enough result. But we're still in the European tyranny by clerk, and our Parliament is viciously, viscerally determined that we shall stay there. It is prepared to override the will of the people in a referendum because it is the settled view of the establishment in Britain that the people can't be expected to take responsible, mature, informed decisions on questions such as, shall we be a democracy or shall we not? That is how arrogant, remote, out of touch, and downright unpleasant the governing class becomes if it finds a mechanism, such as the European Union, for doing away with the democracy that would otherwise keep it in check. Marcus Tullius Cicero once wrote that the treasury must be filled, aid to foreign lands reduced, so that the state shall not become bankrupt. But in the European Union, expenditure on the cost of government, with this extra layer of totally unnecessary government, which is the European Union, plus the cost of the national governments, means that the national debt of most European countries now is greater even than that of the United States. And this is a very severe problem which is building up and building up all the time, and is making it harder and harder for any nation to keep itself going, because the interest payments on past debt exceed now the capacity to borrow anew. So gradually all the purse strings are being tightened, and that means that those who are at the bottom of the heap become fractious, become annoyed, and eventually become revolutionary. You've seen that with the transformation in the once Democratic Party to what is now, in many respects, indistinguishable from the Communist Party.
Mm-hmm.
I hope you'll forgive me for saying this as a foreigner, but it
what
does
it is. It's what it
look
is.
like that to me. And the same has happened with the Labour Party in Britain. It has also become unrecognisable as distinct from a Communist Party. The policies they advocate, the means of carrying them out, all of these are essentially communism repackaged. Mm-hmm. And this is a very disturbing development, because communism is not a democratic system. And right from the start, Lenin was saying, well, we have to have the proletariat because they're the people that will take the shots when the other side try to stop us. But the proletariat can't be trusted to run anything. And you'll see in Lenin's writings precisely the same attitude towards the ordinary people as you now get in the European Union. So, what did we do about it recently? Well, it was clear that we had to get rid of the depressingly awful Theresa May. Now, I've known her since she was at Oxford and I was at Cambridge. And I used to spend a lot of time at Oxford debating at the Union and that sort of thing. And so she was Theresa Brazier then. And she was ambitious but useless then. And nothing has changed since. So she was determined, as the establishment is in Britain, to make sure that we shall not be given our democratic will. And so she did everything to thwart it. And I've been advising a large finance house in Sydney, Australia, on the Brexit thing as it unfolded. And one of its senior partners got in touch with me. Well, he's my brother, actually, so that's why it happened. And he, just in the interest of full disclosure. And he said right early on in the process, once we'd had the vote, he said, what happens now? And I already knew that Theresa May was going to try and derail it. So I wrote and said, she will try to stop it. And he said, but surely with this vote, that it's clear what the people want, she doesn't care. I said, she's never cared about what people think. And so he then wrote 6 months later, when there was this strange court case, saying that Parliament had to agree before we wrote a letter to the EU saying bye-bye. And so I watched that case, and the government deliberately lost it. The issue in the case was a fascinating one. It was, did the Prime Minister, or the government of the day on its own, without Parliament, have the right to change our constitution by saying we were not going to have the European constitution anymore, given that that entailed effectively a change in legislation which can only be made normally by Parliament. Now that was the argument the government ran. The government didn't oppose. That was the argument being put by the people who brought this case. And the judges went along with those people because the government didn't really put up much of a fight. Now, what should the government have said? Well, the fact was that the reason why governments can't make law by themselves, by using what's called the royal prerogative, is that that's a way of cutting out Parliament from the proceedings. It's therefore an anti-democratic thing. But if you have already signed a treaty, which has been made in accordance with your constitutional processes, it's been through the House of Commons, been passed, as we have with the European treaties, and if the treaty says, once you have decided you're leaving the European Union, you must write and tell us you're leaving, then it's not an exercise of a discretion. The royal prerogative is a discretion. It is the exercise of a treaty obligation. Now that's a really obvious argument, and yet at no point at any stage in the proceedings did the government offer that argument. I tried to intervene in the proceedings, and they just said, oh no, the court said, we don't even want to hear that. The reason why was the court wanted to gain this new power to tell governments what to do. And they didn't want me coming along pooping on the party and saying, actually, it's written in the treaty that we have to send this letter. And therefore it's not an exercise of the royal prerogative, because the royal prerogative is a discretion. And there is no discretion. It's a treaty obligation we have to fulfill. And had that argument been put, the court would have had to find in our favour, because the wording of the treaty is entirely plain on the matter. The government didn't offer that argument. Now, why were they so anxious to spin this out for an extra 6 months by having this court case before, in fact it was 9 months in the end, before they wrote the letter saying bye-bye? And it then takes 2 years after that before you can even think of leaving. And in fact, we've now gone over that 2 years as well. We're still not out. The reason was they wanted to cause delay, because then by the time we were due actually to leave, they could legitimately argue, well, the mandate has run out. You know, that was 3 years ago. Look, there's lots of old people who would have voted against Europe. They're all dead now. There's all the young people who, having been brought up by Marxist teachers in school and university, they will all want this Marxist institution, the European Union, so they will vote for it, and then therefore we'll all vote to stay in. That was the game they were playing. So I told all this to the firm in Sydney, and they wrote to me just a few weeks ago saying, oh my God, you've been right all along. And one could see them doing this stage by stage. Because the great thing about when the devil does things is that he is not allowed, he's called the father of lies, but there's only a certain point to which he can conceal things. And it becomes quite obvious what he's up to.
Right.
And so this was a very wicked proceeding to thwart the will of the people. However, it became evident to all, as it had been evident to me right from the start, that Theresa May was playing a very dirty game indeed, and that she therefore had to go. And because she couldn't persuade Parliament to agree on any particular course of action, and she couldn't actually get us to leave the European Union, because she didn't really want to leave it anyway, eventually it was clear that she no longer commanded anybody's confidence, including that of the Labour Party. And at that point, in the old days, the men in grey suits, as they used to be known, who were the senior figures in the Conservative Party, would quietly go to Number 10 and they'd say, well, I'm terribly sorry, Prime Minister, but you've lost the confidence of the party and we're going to have to ask you to resign. Well, that didn't work with Theresa May, so in the end they said, right, we will have a vote of no confidence in you by your own MPs, and she narrowly survived that because the odds had been tilted in her favour by a change in the law which her predecessor had brought in, which if Margaret Thatcher had had the benefit of it, she would never have been deposed at all. And she might even still be there now, which would be wonderful. But eventually there was the vote, and as you know, Boris Johnson is now the Prime Minister, the man with the messy hair that's even messier than that of Donald Trump. And Boris, I've known him for a long time as well, because I once had to sue the Private Eye, which was a journal of which he was one of the editors at the time, because they had libelled me, and I wasn't having that, so I sued them. But when we went to court, all I asked for was my costs, which were small, plus a fulsome apology. And I got that, and so Boris came to see me afterwards, and he said, you know, that was really very civilised of you. Normally, when we libel somebody, they demand sort of thousands and thousands in damages, and you haven't done that. Why not? I said, because I'm a journalist. I believe in freedom of speech for the press, but I also believe that if the press cocks it up, they should do a proper apology quickly. That's the rule I've always followed as a journalist. If I get something wrong, then I correct it. Don't you think that's right, ladies and gentlemen?
Yes.
Yeah, amen.
And so he thought rather highly of me because I had not pursued it to the nth degree. But I did make them actually go to court, and there was he sitting there with his messy hair, while the judge said, oh yes, I see there's been a settlement, and I agree that the settlement is appropriate, and I therefore give it the sanction of the High Court. So he had to sit through that. So Boris Johnson, he comes of a good family. One of his names is De Pfeffel, which sounds somehow appropriate, onomatopoeically for him. It's a messy word, but that goes right back to the Norman Conquest. So his family is even older than mine, which is saying quite a lot. We think we go back to the Norman Conquest, but we can't prove it. We can only get back to 1296, because the wretched College of Arms lost the records further back than that. But he comes from a very ancient aristocratic family. He has a very good mind. He got a first-class degree in Greeks, which is classical Latin and Greek at Oxford. I studied that at Cambridge. He studied at Oxford, slightly after I did. And so he has got probably the best mind since Margaret Thatcher to have gone into number 10. He is also, and here he is one up on Margaret Thatcher, a naturally good orator who can speak right across the political divide and right across the class divide, because he is completely unashamed about his background. And therefore, and actually working people like this. They like it when I go along and say, go down on one knee and touch your forelock, you're in the presence of a lord and let's have some proper deference. And they enjoy it, because they know I don't actually mean it, but they like that kind of joshing, and he does that beautifully. And so he is one who can reach across from the governing class to the working class and get the governing class to align itself a bit more with the working class than it does at the moment. And what I think he will do, if he plays this right, is he'll outflank the bureaucratic elite that runs things. And they'll suddenly find themselves squeezed from two directions. You've got the cabinet, which is now more or less to a man, solid Brexiteers. These are people who want to leave the European Union. And you've got the people, the working people in particular. It's very interesting. The working people, just as with Trump here, so with the United Kingdom now, the working people are increasingly voting for the Conservatives, just as they're voting for the Republicans here, because they have realised that something has gone desperately wrong with the left. The left no longer even make the pretense that Lenin said they had to make of representing the interests of the proletariat. They have complete contempt for working people. They hate working people. And therefore, just as Steve Bannon, whom I talked to just before he went into the White House to work for Trump, he said, I'm going to tell Trump he needs to spend his time and effort in the Rust Belt states in the middle of the country. Don't worry about the la-la land states on the coastal fringes. They are a basket case, nothing can be done. Don't waste your time there. Spend your time in places like Iowa and South Carolina where there's working people and they are fed up with the fact that all the jobs are going to China because of all the damn fool socialist regulations. And that's how Trump won, even though I think he was 3 million votes short of actually having a majority. What he did do was to get a majority in the Electoral College by targeting those states precisely where the working people were fed up with the Democrats. Now, Boris Johnson has that capacity to reach across to working people, and even the BBC noticed this when he was Mayor of London, and he gave a speech in Hyde Park before a crowd that just gathered from nowhere before the Olympics, saying that we were going to have fun, it was going to be a well-organised Olympics, and it was all kind and so forth. And they cheered him to the echo, not because of anything particular that he said, but just the manner in which he said it, and the manner in which he gave the impression of enjoying their company. And this was fascinating. The BBC commentator reported us, he said, well, I've never seen a politician who can so engage with an audience of people from a completely different background in the way that he's just done. And even the BBC, which is relentlessly Marxist, found itself respecting him to some degree because he could do that. And that is exactly the kind of person we now need to try to sort out the mess which the useless Theresa May, who couldn't communicate with anybody at any level, has left behind her. Because we now have this irreconcilable conflict between Parliament on the one hand, and the Cabinet and the working people and the Brexiteer voters on the other. And then there's the European tyranny by Clark, which knows that all it has to do is sit back and do nothing and leave Parliament to interfere with the process of letting us out of the European Union. So Parliament is trying to think of ways of stopping Boris from going to the Queen and saying, please prorogue Parliament until All Saints' Day. because All Saints' Day is the day after Halloween, the day on which we're due to leave the EU. If we actually succeeded leaving the EU, we are going to have the most enormous Halloween party. There will be a lot of noisy fireworks. We'll have to invite all the neighbours, because otherwise they'll be woken up. So it's going to be a great day. And so the question is, how is he going to play this? And there are a number of possibilities. One that I know he will do is he will get straight in touch with the leading players in the European Commission, the commissars, and he will, with the so-called negotiator for the EU, Michel Barnier, who is not in fact a chief negotiator. His job is not to negotiate, it's simply to tell Britain what the EU has decided we shall be allowed and not allowed to do. And Theresa May never worked this out, but Boris Johnson understands that distinction. He's not a negotiator. So he's going to get these people to check it. I think this is what he'll do. It's what I would do in his place, and I'm reasonably sure he'll do this. And he'll simply say, please come and stay with me for the weekend. There is no agenda. It's going to be a house party. Now, you see the difference between him and Theresa May. Theresa May was always going cap in hand to Europe to beg to be let free, or rather to sit there with Juncker chuckling to herself and saying, right, how can we stop this? And Boris is doing it, he's going to do it differently. He'll say, come to us. And if they say, oh no, it's you who want to leave us, you've got to come and see us, he can then go public and say, I simply invited them for the weekend. And they wouldn't come because they say, we are the suppliants that have to go to them. Does that not tell you, oh people of Britain, what is really going on here and why it is that we really need to leave? We have no democratic control whatsoever over these people, and they won't even come and sup with me at my own dining table for a weekend and just do a little shooting and fishing. Mm-hmm. And that would tell the story to the people. I think he may try to work that trick. I think he may also try to make sure that no new parliamentary bill is introduced in Parliament between now and All Saints' Day, because with no bill in Parliament, there's nothing for the other side to amend so that they can wreck the process of the clock ticking down and then us simply leaving the European Union without having negotiated a deal on our future arrangements and trade with them. And will that be messy? Not particularly. After all, when we joined the EU, we suddenly had to tear up all our trade agreements with the whole of the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. Did this indeed cause queues of lorries from London to Dover? Did this cause dislocation? Did the British economy take a nosedive? It did none of those things. And so the only reason why we're told that a no-deal Brexit would mean Britain crashing out, this is the phrase, crashing out, is because they're trying to frighten us into staying in the EU altogether. But I think he'll just play the waiting game. He won't let Parliament interfere at all. He can't actually get away with proroguing it, though he could try. I think you have to leave it there, but just not bring forward any bill until after All Saints' Day. The clock will run out, parliamentarians will find themselves powerless, and we shall be, as you are now, a free nation once again. Thank you.